Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And this is, of course, really interesting. Here we have Roman historians confirming a number of things that we read in the main source about the origin of the Christian church and about Jesus of Nazareth. Namely, that Christianity rapidly spread from Judea all the way to Rome. That this group, Christians, had their name from Christ. And that Christ was executed by a Roman official, or was sentenced to death by a Roman official, Pontius Pilate, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. So it's not a lot of information, but it is a kind of confirmation to what the main source, in much more detail, is telling us. N.T. Wright, who is one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world today, he answers the question on Jesus' existence this way. How do we know Jesus existed? And his answer is, it is quite difficult to know where to start, because actually the evidence for Jesus is so massive that, as a historian, I want to say we've got almost as much good evidence for Jesus as for anyone in the ancient world. The evidence fits so well with what we know of the Judaism of the period that I think there are hardly any historians today. In fact, I don't know of any historians today who doubt the existence of Jesus. It is quite clear that, in fact, Jesus is a very, very well-documented character of real history. So, this is not actually an issue. There was a man, Jesus from Nazareth. The real issues are quite different issues. What was his identity? What was his teaching? How do we understand him? What happened after his crucifixion? And so on. That's real issues. A number of people do still want to ask questions about the source situation. Okay, maybe he existed, but isn't it strange that we just have those small pieces of information in sources outside the New Testament about him? If he was that wonderful and strong personality, we should expect much, much more in, for example, Roman writings from the first century. So, Lena Einhorn, one of the authors I referred to earlier, she says Jesus was unnoticed by the historians of his time. The former Archbishop in Sweden, K.G. Hammar, he says this: how can you explain that something so profound has left so little traces outside the Gospels? So they kind of think this is a strange situation. It's something suspicious here. Well, let's make some reflection on that. First, we need to take some basic facts into account. If we follow the main source, the Gospels, Jesus lived 30 years of anonymity, and he had only 3 years of public ministry. And during those 3 years, he went around in the villages of Galilee in the north of Israel. He just visited Jerusalem 3 or 4 times. Come on, this was before there were helicopters and email and fax machines and cell phones. 3 years of public ministry in the north of Israel, in Galilee. It's not reasonable to think that in the 40s or 50s there would be, or in the 30s, during those 3 years, there would be a lot of discussion in Rome about this creature. Secondly, Jesus apparently had his own reasons to have a low profile during those 3 years because of the specific expectations on the coming Messiah. And Jesus saw himself as the coming Messiah. But his understanding of Messiah was not in harmony with his culture's expectations on the coming of Messiah, and therefore, for some times he withheld the rumors about what he was doing. Thirdly, he was wrongly put to death. The whole trial was a setup. They had bribed the witness. He was falsely accused and falsely sentenced to death. And of course, the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities They had no interest later to have all the lights on this trial. And fourthly, Jerusalem was destroyed 70 AD. I'm sure there were archives in Jerusalem related to the trial of Jesus from Nazareth. But the whole city of Jerusalem was wiped out AD 70, and all archives destroyed, of course. Now here's a very important point to catch. I guess some of you have had, as I had a few years ago, the terrible experience of a hard disk crash. You know, losing all your material. It's horrible. You know, in antiquity, they had their hard disk crashes. Of course, it's a metaphor. But they lost all their written material. Why? Because the libraries were burned down. Because moist destroyed the material they wrote on. Because of the enemy's armies destroying all your writing and so on. Let me give you an example. This is the Roman historian Suetonius. One of his writings has survived into our time. That is his writing, The 12 Caesars. It's a very important source of information for us about Roman emperors. Then we have access to, in part, to 3 other writings. We don't have the whole texts of those 3 writings, but we have part of them. They have survived. But then we know from different sources that Suetonius, he wrote at least 14 other books, and none of them has survived into our time. They have crashed during the transmission through history, and we don't know what they said. It is like that with all writers from antiquity. Most of what they wrote has crashed during history, and we don't have access to it any longer. And this means it's not a very good question to say we should have more material about this event or about this figure. Because it's totally random what has crashed and what has survived. And as a historian, you have to work with what actually has survived. That's life. You cannot ask for all the things that did not survive and have a lot of expectation of how much material we should have access to today. We have what we have. Let me press this on this point a little bit further. If we then take a look at those Roman historians whose texts actually have survived into our time, what is the situation? Who could have written about Jesus? Well, the situation is this. Titus Livius was a Roman historian. He wrote History of Rome from its foundation. He was born 59 BC, he died 70 AD. He couldn't write about Jesus because Jesus had not become public 70 AD. The next historian is Protoculus. He was born 20 BC, he died 30 AD. His book on Roman history ends the year 29. The last event he records is the death of one of the wives of Emperor Augustus. And that death happened the year 29. Could he have written about Jesus? Well, generally, he's not writing about different religious movements and different individuals. He's writing only about things that are directly affecting the Roman Empire. And therefore, he is, of course, concerned about the royal family and so on. But still, just as a possibility, could he have written about Jesus of Nazareth? Well, that depends on how you date Jesus' public ministry. There are 2 alternatives. One is that Jesus' public ministry was AD 30 to AD 33. If that is the case, of course, Protoculus could not write about Jesus. He died before, or his writing ends before Jesus was public. The other alternative is to date Jesus' public ministry 27 to 30. But that still means that Protoculus, whose writing ends 29, actually cannot write about Jesus. Because the year 29 Jesus still has not come in contact to the Roman officials. He is still a preacher up in the different villages in Galilee. So Paterculus has no chance to write about Jesus. Then, the next Roman historians whose texts have survived into our day, that is Publius Cornelius Tacitus. And he actually writes about Jesus. I just quoted it. What he is saying about Jesus of Nazareth. There is nothing strange in this situation. The first Roman historians whose texts have survived into our day that could have written about Jesus, he actually writes about Jesus. Now, the Roman, the Jewish historian Josephus, the Roman historians, they are not the key sources to our knowledge about Jesus. The key sources is the text we have in the New Testament. That is the main source and the all-important source about Jesus. And of course, a lot of people think that in itself is a big problem. The New Testament, people say, is so deeply problematic. Firstly, it is too religious. It's such a strange book. You cannot read one page before you have references to God and to miracles and to sick people being healed and dead being raised and revelations coming and voices from heaven. That's not historical material. That is a lot of religious and supernatural stuff. So we must dismiss this as a source of historical knowledge. That is what people are thinking. Now, is that so? Yeah, it's absolutely so that the New Testament is filled with references to the supernatural. But does that undermine the New Testament as a historical source about Jesus and the emerging church? Now, I don't know how much source material you have read from antiquity. But let me ask you a question. Do you think that other source material from antiquity contains references to God, or the gods, or the supernatural, or to faith, or to, fate, or to a spiritual dimension? I think you can give the answer. Yeah, of course. Most people up until the Enlightenment time believed in the supernatural, in God or in gods, in a spiritual dimension. And in most sources, there are references to this. That in itself does not undermine a source as a historical source about what actually happened. Let me give you an example. Suetonius, in one of the texts that has survived into our times, he tells about Julius Caesar.